Hey man, good to see you.
Nice seeing you too, man.
I get a peek into the background. What's going on back there?
A little bit of a peek.
You want to bring the whole thing closer?
Oh man.
Should we start by let me ask you where my painting at? Don't you owe me a painting?
I do. I think you want to.
All right,
Yeah.
I'll do my introduction, man, and I'm looking forward to hearing you speak.
Okay.
Cool. My name is Michael Ray Charles, and I am the Hugh Roy and Lily Franz Collins Distinguished Professor of Painting here at the University of Houston. It's my pleasure to have Radcliffe Bailey here today, and it's a pleasure to have all of you guys here today. As we get a move towards Radcliffe's presentation, I just want to make sure that you guys are aware that we will have a Q&A session towards the end of the presentation. However, there are options for you to ask questions during the lecture, as Radcliffe has expressed to me. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce whom I think is an amazing artist and creative force, and a dear friend, Radcliffe Bailey. He's a painter, sculptor, and a mixed media artist, to say the least, and utilizes layering of imagery, culturally resonant materials and text to explore themes of ancestral race and memory, among a number of other things. And I think we're going to get into that today, and I encourage you guys to formulate questions with regards to his subject matter. Radcliffe was born in Bridgetown, New Jersey, and grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, where he currently works. He received a BFA from the Atlanta College of the Arts in '91, and since that time, he's had an extremely productive career and continues to have an extremely productive career. His work has been included in numerous group and solo exhibitions. You know, what's the most recent count? Is it 50? It's probably 100 by now, right?
Oh man.
Solo exhibitions in various venues, from the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, the MoMA PS in New York, Contemporary Arts in New Orleans, Fay Gold Gallery in Atlanta, the McNay in San Antonio, the Toledo Museum of Art in Ohio, the Blaffer Museum here on our campus. And in addition to a number of exhibitions at his home gallery, Jack Shaman in New York, where he's been there since the late 90s. In addition to the many public and private collections, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Smithsonian Museum in DC, and the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, the Cochran Museum. The list could go on. The Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, and the High Museum of Art. There are numerous private collections, and not to mention the public art that you've done. So please help me in welcoming Radcliffe Bailey to our community today.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that. All right. So I guess we can start from the first slide. And starting from the first slide, I don't know if it's up now. Is it up now? Okay, gotcha. Well, while you pull that up, I'll just say, you know, I've been in Atlanta since 1972. My parents moved here when I was young, so I kind of grew up kind of in the South, but my family being from New Jersey and different parts of South, which sometimes, you know, I refer to Virginia as the South as well. I had family members in Virginia, but my family moved back down to Atlanta in '72, And it was based around the fact that they wanted me and my brother to grow up in a different environment in New Jersey. We were a little bit more isolated in New Jersey. And we lived in what is more so like considered the Garden State, a little bit more rural area. And I grew up with just around my family. All my family members lived on the street, and we were all pretty close. So moving to Atlanta, I pretty much grew up with just my mom, my dad, and my brother as my as the closest only family members down here in Atlanta. But it was shortly after the assassination of King, and it was an interesting moment to be in Atlanta, being exposed to a lot of African Americans, business, in terms of African American mayors, and grew up in a totally different environment than in New Jersey. This first painting, some of the images are going to be a little bit random, but this first image is of a work on paper that was done using having the use of photographs I took of art, and I was moving on different art collections from Birmingham. And my earlier work was which you'll kind of in and out of some of the imagery and the photographs that I've gotten from my grandmother. And it's a combination of that. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're breaking up a little.
Okay, let me pull this. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay.
So photographs.
Right. And the photographs that I received from my grandmother were photographs of African Americans from the early 1900s. They were tintypes. Some were tintypes. A good amount of them were tintypes. And I began working with that imagery right after college, and I slowly moved from which my original major when I was in college was a sculpture major. And so I really began painting just as a way of making work and making things, because I wasn't really completely set up at the moment so that I could work in sculpture. So I bounced between those two different ways of working, between paint and sculpture, and using photography. And part of it was based on thinking about other worlds, things that were tangible and things that weren't tangible. It's a combination of the two of those together. And some of my earlier influences of, like, I mentioned before the other day, was the influence of James Vandersea was one of the first artists I met when I was a kid, and then also Jacob Lawrence. And they were exposed to me by my mother. You can go to the next slide. This piece is called Returnal, and it's inside of a cabinet. And the reason why it's inside a cabinet instead I refer to as a frame, because it was the idea of like a cabinet for medicine. And I was making these cabinets that were based around Congolese figures for Nikisis, and which were these kind of figures with these cases and the stomach of the sculptures. And so the idea was that whenever you're sick, you go to a medicine cabinet. For me, it was like dealing with memory. And so I also, like, as an African-American artist and going to school, I never really knew my makeup, my DNA. And I eventually, really my work at that time and up till like 2006, it was pretty much like a quest to just figure out who I was. DNA wise. And so I traced my mother's side to Sierra Leone and Guinea. And so there are references of my work to those places. You can go to the next slide. This is a painting called From East to West, from South to North. And it was just dealing with the movement of family members from North, South to East to West. And it's really about the layout of maps and viewing the world from up above. And some of it was based around the layout of DC. And so, it's a mix of a lot of different kind of thoughts. And, with my earlier paintings, I had this thing about doing layers, and I never knew when to stop. Stop on the seventh layer. Sometimes the seventh layer is 7 layers of thought, 7 physical layers. You go to the next slide. This is called Minor Keys, and based around a favorite musician, Sun Ra, how he talked about outer space, and then also since he played the piano, so on the inside of the piano are the piano keys covered with black wax, and there's also like planets, and so what you have is like planets kind of floating around, and at the top of it, you can't see it, but there's glass that's tinted blue, and so when you look down at it when it's lit, it appears like the ocean and space, and I'm often trying to compare the two, like the deeper you go in the ocean, how similar it is to space, and how we sit at a crossroads between the two. You can go to the next slide. This one doesn't really have a lot of explanation to it, besides the fact it was a piano top. And it was a piano top that was taken from a local high school. And so when the kids would go in and go to take classes in music, they would carve their name on the top of the piano. You can go to the next slide. And okay, you can go back one more. And so you can kind of see where they carved their names on top of the piano. And I gold leafed the piano. And I didn't really have a meaning or a title behind the piece as much as it was just reflecting on what it was growing up in high school and remembering kids like at certain moments would carve their names and mark themselves on with time. So you can go to the next slide. Pieces that are called based around returnal, and when I say returnal, it's just refer to going back and traveling, and there's a lot of references to that. But then also I have family members that were Garveyites, and so there's a reference to that as well. And my family, as I mentioned earlier, were from New Jersey, but they ended up in New Jersey because they were a part of Underground Railroad, and they were trying to migrate towards Canada, and they met some Quakers in South Jersey, and that was kind of a moment in my family's history. So this piece is documenting that crossing the Mason-Dixon line, as well as on top of the there are constellations and dealing with reading the stars and traveling. You can go to the next slide. This piece was inspired by a trip I took to Belgium and going through the Royal Museum of Central Africa. And I remember going to the museum and I knew and I heard about, how Leopold went through the Congo and dealt with rubber. And he tried to make show an example to the Congolese that, if they didn't do enough in terms of, producing and bringing in rubber, that he would cut off some of the limbs. And so I have these religious figure limbs that sit over top of this rubber. And so the actual piece is made out of rubber with the limbs. You can go to the next slide. That's kind of detail of it. And next slide. This is called Echo. Echo is based around the Great Mosque in Mali. And it's a echo. I say echo because I'm referring to when they would redo the mosque during different times of the season. So, and they would redo it with clay. And so I also, with this, was referring to growing up in the South and dealing with Georgia clay. And so there's Georgia clay that kind of drips into a shell. You can go to the next slide. I don't really have a title for this piece. And it was about those lost at sea, and also just tracing DNA and referring to all the different parts of Africa a lot of African Americans come from, or those are even those that are in Brazil, people in Brazil and Cuba and Haiti, and just referencing the practices and how they travel. And I put them inside of a boat that and from a fishing village that was from Senegal. And it was about returning. It's part of like the same body with the images of with boats and ships. You can go to the next slide. This is a piece I made, and it's of a heart. A heart itself is the title was based on Pullman, and the Pullman on the trains, but then it's also based around pulmonary, and so it's a heart that's crusted with like bluish black glitter. Go to the next slide. I made this sculpture based around W.B. Du Bois, and it was UMass Amherst. I did the piece for. It was a show based around Du Bois, and I collected the wood from an area where Du Bois lived, and I made the sculpture in bronze at Syracuse, and I made him, you can go to the next slide, as the thinker. So I refer to Du Bois as the thinker, but it's trying to be humorous about it because he's such a serious dude. But that was a piece. You go to the next slide. This is crocodile, and this was collected from antique dealer from Belgium, and specialized in like different objects, and it was deaccession from a museum. I'm not sure exactly what museum it was from. It could have been the museum where Leopold, the Royal Museum of Central Africa, but not sure. But on the tarp itself, it's called On the Way Up, and it was based around my two grandfathers, one on my mother's side, my father's side, and I have dates and times, and they're stitched in, on the tarp of when they died and the year that they were born, and that's On the Way Up. And you go to the next slide. This piece is called Levitate, and it's one of those boats that I work with from Senegal. And the boat itself kind of levitates in front of the piece, so it floats out about a foot. So it's just a lot of stitching and marking, and it's stitching and marking in the sense of the same way in which my paintings are. You go next slide. This piece is called Nest. It's around things. It's based around falcons and how they're used inside of Egyptian art, but then also it's got a taxidermy of a falcon on the top, and also dealing with my team in Atlanta that just can't win games. But up under it's piano keys in the shape of a nest. And you go to the next slide. And this piece also has a falcon, a replica of a falcon that's at the top, Egyptian falcon, but it also has like the 14-year, 17-year locust cicadas. And I was visiting my grandparents, and I remember at that time that storm happened. I was in the middle of it, and it was almost like raining these insects everywhere. And so I collected some of those insects and put them inside of a bottle. And there's a photo album. You go to the next slide. And there's a photo album there that's like the one that my grandmother gave me, and I dipped it in Georgia clay. And there's also a hand on the side which has Saturn on it, and has a slide, like an old slide of Saturn. So yeah, that's called Lost and Found. Okay, you go to the next slide. This is called Rocking, and Rocking's just based around music. When I say music, I'm referring to like Bob Marley and the use of the word rocking. And so there's a rock that was collected from my backyard, there was a quarry in my backyard. Part of some of the reasons I'm referring to the quarry in my backyard was that when I think about it, there are the old cobble streets there in the city of Atlanta. Some of these rocks and boulders come from those different that were made to use for the cobble streets, came from like areas like my backyard. My backyard was, there was a war, a part of the Civil War that was fought back there, and it was the Battle of Utoy Creek. So I'm like referring to rock and referring to dance, but dance was more so like a performance. You can go to the next slide. Performance in terms of me dancing on top of the piece. So the black parts are really like black paint. And but it's also, you know, when I say rock, and I'm even referring to Michael Jackson. So it's a combination of a lot of things. So next slide. This was a piece that was made in New Orleans. I made this music stand that was about 11 feet tall. And on top of it, I collected instruments from the Ninth Ward in New Orleans. And these were instruments that were damaged from Katrina. And so what hit me about it, when I thought about it, when I remember when the hurricane, when it happened, I remember all the musicians moving around and traveling. And I remember them coming through Atlanta. And I was very like, it's profound to actually feel like the things that happened in New Orleans, the culture was still like moving throughout those moments. So it was just a reference to that. And you go to the next slide. And next slide. Next one. This was a piece that was done, was commissioned by the Gordon Parks Foundation. I did it based on a photograph that Gordon Parks took, and where he created this body of work with Ralph Ellison. And it was about, you know, around the Invisible Man. So it was a piece that was commissioned, and the photograph itself, you could kind of see like this image with the chair and the two turntables and the lights. And I made it in dimensions so where you could pretty much sit on the inside of the piece itself. You go to the next slide. This piece is based on Eshu, Yoruba deities, and Eshu for Legba, and it's made out of a rock, and the rock itself sits in the cradle of a slave car for those who would run away. The rock itself is sometimes a symbol where you see with Eshu, which you see this kind of like concrete rock with cowrie shells as eyes, mouth. And it was a reference to that. And top hat on a trickster, but also thinking about the fact of like a self-portrait in a way, where artists are more so like that kind of trickster, where we have a lot to say, and we also sit in between two different worlds, things that are tangible and things that are not. And you go next. Yes.
Right. Yes. If you could go back to that last image, the crossbars, that's a reference to a slave collar, no?
Yeah, right. That's a reference to a slave collar, but it's also a reference to like crossroads. So okay. I'm trying to play with the dual meanings behind it. And the intersection at the head, at the mind, which is interesting. Exactly. And the tarp is there's a canvas that I painted that was really dealing with the colors that are associated with Eshu, which were red and black. You go to the next slide. This is a piece that was commissioned by the Atlanta Falcons, their new stadium. And I was asked to make this piece. And I made this piece based around historically Black colleges that were located not far, a throne's throw away from the stadium itself. So what you have is photographs from like 1911 to, I think it goes back to 1901, HBCUs from Lincoln University to Howard to, and also university. And you'll see images of the ball players. I was doing this working with a ball player named Pelham McDaniels. And Pelham McDaniels was also a scholar at Emory University, collected a lot of rare images of African Americans in sports. He played for the Falcons and played with the Kansas City Chiefs. And I put this image up too because he felt be a victim through the pandemic, and he caught the virus, and we lost him like in the early parts of it. And yeah, so you go to the next slide. This piece is I call it caravan, but it's a paint. It's about maybe 11 feet tall by like maybe 4.5, 5 feet. And it was a photograph that I collected through Pelham. And this was an image of 4 guys, and it appeared to be like 4 guys. I couldn't really tell exactly. A lot of photographs, I respond to them. I couldn't really tell exactly what to do. And I know that one has a cigar in his hand, the other one's pouring a drink. And I felt like I put this in because I lost a friend. And it was about like a response to like maybe they were at a funeral, maybe they were, thinking about one of their friends, and so it's a response to that. But it's also like there's a boat at the bottom, and sometimes I use found objects that I collect. And one of these objects that I collected was a boat that was made out of matchsticks, and it was more like art that was made from prisons. And so it's a respond to that. And yeah, next slide. This one is, I think I call it Palmetto Blues. And I did this around the time of the shooting at the church in Charleston. So I have railroad tracks, which, you guys see that's running through my work. The railroad tracks come from my father being a railroad engineer, and as well as a reference to the Underground Railroad. And also, like the tracks, the reason why they're red is really dealing with blood red. And it was a piece to deal with the subject matter. But, often I'll make works like this, but I don't necessarily talk exactly about the subject matter, what it was about. And I'm just really like making sometimes I'm trying to make a visually beautiful image towards a painful subject matter. You go to the next slide. This is another tarp. This is about 20 feet. It's hard to tell the scale of it, but it's about 20 feet high. And it was based around the intersections around the city of Atlanta and where some of the tracks met. And also it was turning it into crossroads. And at the very top of it, you have like a neon inn. And then the neon inn, it was just based around the North Star. You can go to the next. There's a piece called Vessel. Vessel I did for Prospect about 4 years ago. And I made the piece, and there's a sound where I work with a musician named Corey Johnson, and he plays the cello. And the idea that I had about it, I invited him over during a full moon, and I burnt a fire in my backyard. And because I was on the Civil War grounds, so what I did this recording of him, and I gave him thoughts to respond to. And then I also gave him sounds of the ocean and sounds of trains. So the idea was like, crossing the Atlantic. So you hear sounds of the ocean, but then you also hear the popping of the fire. But then it subtly comes in the sounds of trains. And then also in the background, you can hear dogs barking in the background. You can hear the sounds of a city in the distance. And you can go to the next slide. And I made 3 different ones, and they're all similar, but there's to order to have the sounds are coming out the conch shell, but there's also a stereo system that's built on the inside of it that you can't see, that where it has sound coming through the sides as well. Here you go to the next slide. And next one. This one's called Wimmer Coast. This is a piece that I took about 400 sets of piano keys and I turned them into the ocean, and I spread it out amongst the floor. You can go to the next slide. And you can kind of get a detail. And it's about those lost at sea. It was about a lot of things. It was about these different tsunamis, and I just remember seeing images on TV, and Katrina, It was a piece that I wanted to travel to different places. I've shown it in Colombia, Cartagena, also Dakar, and New Orleans. And it's a piece that I kind of carry with myself, and I'd like to show it in different places or with a certain history that deals with travel and storms and just crossing the Atlantic. And you can go to the next slide.
Radcliffe, what's the name of this particular piece?
Windward Coast.
When you first display this, and I think I saw this in San Antonio or some version of it.
Yeah, I first did the piece maybe 2001. I think it's probably like 2001. I created a piece in my studio, and it took up so much space I couldn't work, so I had to put it up. Yeah, but I made the piece as well the story behind the piece was that there was a piano shop around the corner from where I grew up in Atlanta, and I would walk down the street, and I would always look inside the shop itself. And one day I was walking by, I was driving by later on after, during art school, and I remember seeing these guys pulling out these pianos, and they were taking out these keys out pianos, and they were putting them on fire because they didn't know what to do with it. They thought that the metal in the pianos were more valuable than anything. So I just started collecting them, and I brought them back to the studio, not really thinking, and just stacked them in the studio and realized that I already made the piece. It was one of those kind of pieces that happened within a day. And yeah, and you can go next slide. And I'm coming close to the end. This is a piece called Nomo, and it's a reference to the Dogon. But this piece was done in Istanbul for the Istanbul Biennale. And what I did was that I made the piece on site in Istanbul, and I wanted to make like a bottom of a ship, but I also wanted to make a ship I refer to as almost like a spaceship in some sense. And in the back, there was stories that they were saying that Sun Ra played in Istanbul, and he was on the back of a 18-wheeler traveling through the city, and they were playing on the back of an 18-wheeler, and I had the recordings of Sun Ra's music playing in the background, as well as I work with a musician named Taurus Mantine, who's a bass player who I collaborated with when I was I used to go here and play when I was in college, and he played at this jazz club. And yeah, but he was playing this jazz club, but he was also working with a lot of hip hop musicians. So it was crossed between the two different ones. And so I worked with him on this piece as well. You go next slide. This is a piece that I did based around the Door of No Return. So this piece is like a photograph of the ocean and looks out onto the sea. And Door of No Return from Gorée Island in Senegal. It was after I made a trip to Senegal. I made the piece when I got back. But, you know, when you go into the Door of No Return, it's like a dungeon. And when you look out to the sea, that's the last, you know, when they stepped outside of that door, that was their last time, their last foots on the continent. And so on the outside of it, you have like glitter and black sand mixed. So it almost appears to be almost as if it was outer space on a clear night. And so it's a reference to that in traveling between those two different worlds, kind of like when I referred to with my work earlier. And yeah, and that's it.
Well, that's an interesting way to end it. I was ready. Wow. There's been many works of yours that I've enjoyed over the years, and that last one, pretty powerful.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
So is that one mine?
Well,
I'm just saying. Okay, you do owe me a painting, by the way. So
uh,
there's a number of things that we've been talking about. You've been talking about, and points of that I feel, well, I have a list of things that I've jotted down that came to mind just listening to you talk. And I know there are intersections in between these things. We go back a ways, and we often talk about music, and I couldn't help but, it's all it's in your work. And I know there has to be moments and installations that you've done where music has been emphasized in relationship to objects that you've constructed. You care to talk about the role that music plays? If I could say a physical role or audio role, it has a definite place in the work, both symbolically, referencing pianos, materials from pianos, horns that are silent, as well as audio.
right, right. Well, when I think about my work, my studio practice, well, number one, the studio is church for me. When I'm working, I mean, with most artists, we have music in the background. Sometimes we listen, sometimes we don't. There's always like a moment with my work where I have to have this kind of sound running through my work. Sometimes I'll play a piece over and over. In particular, like when my studio's clean and clear, I play a Love Supreme. And I'll play a Love Supreme, but I'll play it at midnight. And that's just that moment when I just have to like kind of find some type of call to prayer, some type of way to create a space. I know when we go to studio, we kind of go to war with some of the stuff that we're trying to deal with in the world, trying to fix stuff. But music is a big part of it. Yes, I play all kinds of music. When I want to deal with a certain part of myself, I'll play some hip hop. There's parts of it. I just pop music as I was when I was younger. But I'm like one of the past. I'm like fascinated with the past. There's so much about. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, that's probably when I move. So I play a lot of music from the past, and I feel like there's so much of the past that we don't know, that I'm so fascinated with trying to figure out what a past that I don't know. You got me hip to Pee Wee. I love Lightning Hopkins. I love like Ali Fakatore. I love like Mahalia Jackson. I love Abby Lincoln. I don't know. It's so many. And then there's a moment where I want to play certain kinds of jazz, avant-garde. There's like Albert Ayler. There's Cecil Taylor.
Get out of James, man. Can't forget.
Oh yeah. Oh no, I'm not. No. If we start talking about music, I don't think we'll stop. I think we'll go on and on and on.
But I know it's in your work. I see it all the time, and sometimes it's underscore and it's quiet, and sometimes it's pretty loud. And it's not just a reference to, for example, that piece that you did in New Orleans with the horns. I personally, for many years, I had old instruments that were damaged that I would hang on my wall in the library. And my wife thought I was crazy. And I had this orange guitar, and I always wanted it. And you couldn't play it. None of them could be played. There was the trumpet, the cornet was bent, but aesthetically, I looked at those as having potential for sound, like,
Right.
or even the that potential was still present despite the tarnished, tattered, worn, damaged form that it took. They were contorted and damaged. The guitar had a hole in the back. Man, I just love those things. And to see you find a similar pleasure in the use of those tools fascinates me. That's an amazing piece. I didn't jot down the name of it, but I could hear sounds when I see instruments. And I played in a band as a kid, and of course, music in Black culture and in world culture music.
Right.
So, my first question was a lead off to that. I had a conversation with someone about James Brown earlier, and I had the pleasure to meet James Brown. And one of the thrills
Oh, wow.
of my life in terms of influences, and because you talk about the past and present, his music was being sampled in hip hop, for many years, and probably still is to a certain degree. So it's like we continue to listen to James Brown, after all these years. And I'm wondering if are there any particular visual artists that you go to? Like, for me, there's a range of musicians and singers. I'll go back to James Brown crooning years, when he's singing. I think it's the late '60s, maybe it's the '50s, but he's singing "I Lost Someone" and "Try Me." And when this over and over and over, are there any visual artists that kind of you refer to like that?
Yeah, I would, we often sometimes, there are certain people. I remember my college professor, his name is Curtis Patterson, African American sculptor. I remember he kind of got me hip to Coltrane. And I remember seeing it in his work. And it had this kind of quiet, elegant, beautiful. It could speak of certain moments. In terms of visual artists, I don't. Every visual artist, I have hundreds of artists that I kind of, I respect and I understand.
I didn't mean to make
Let me
you
see.
one or anything
Right. I got you. It's hard to mention one without mentioning them all. That's like the music. Yeah. That's the thing. There's so many people.
But it's kind of like you can learn a lot about someone simply by what they keep closer to their bodies, things that they protect, the things that they value the most, right?
Right.
Is there a recent person that you're going to? Because I just discovered Marvin Gaye's "Forever," right? And I got that on loop. That is crazy. It's a little depressing, the song, but it's an amazing song. In terms of Marvin Gaye's range, So right now, that's one of those closer sources to me as an artist. It's not necessarily a visual artist, but an artist. All right. I'm not gonna lie. I've been looking at your book. I'm not gonna lie. I've been looking at your book.
You're funny.
Oh, really?
Oh, I hear you. I think, I was listening to, what was I listening to the other day that I listened to? I've been listening to since college and I'll go somewhere else, reggae, but it's dub music. I've been listening to Aswad. Aswad has an album called A New Chapter in Dub, and it's dub music. And I listen a lot to them, but also poet named Linton Kwesi Johnson. a dub poet. And, you know, I often like, you know, play their music kind of back to back. Yeah, yeah.
You know, I talk about music a lot, and it's present. But do you see that? I know you see it in your work. Could you talk about how that manifests formally in other ways in the work? Because it's throughout, I think.
Right, right. Another, I mean, that's another material. That's just one material, but it's more like the glue itself, and then there's the performance part of it, and then I respond to it. And I don't take it lightly. It's almost like my my stereo system with I still have my stereo system from when my old studio, which kind of carries like 250 CDs, and I push it on random and I let it talk to me. And you know, it's one of those kind of things. I don't want to know what's coming up. I want it to just hit me. I want it to do its own thing. I want to be in tune with it. But then there are moments I have my iPod in my head and I don't need to play anything. I just allow it to play on a memory, just playing something over and over. So sometimes it could be like 15 seconds of a song over and over, playing over and over in my head. Sometimes I don't really play any music at all, and I just listen to nature. And that's why I think I mentioned that I listen to A Love Supreme at midnight. But I also, at midnight, when everything's quiet, I can hear myself think. But yeah, it's a big part of my work. It's hard to explain.
Yeah.
I don't think it's very difficult to work without music.
Yeah.
I don't know how I could do it without music. It's, you know, for me, it's like one of those layers in the work. It's gonna come out. And then there are moments when, you know, there's work that I'm making that's a little more minimal.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, that goes into, you know, a different, I think that's really the moments when I'm listening to myself.
I'm interested in that, but before we go further into that, what you just said, the work that's more minimal. Before we
Right.
go there, we have a question from a sculptor professor, Jillian Conrad. Jillian, want to ask your question?
Sorry, I didn't have a question. Sorry. I actually do, but it was, I didn't purposely raise my hand. I'm sorry. I'm just really enjoying listening though. Thank you.
Well, let's go back there, because that last piece is more minimal.
Right.
You know, sometimes some of the work that I've seen, it's filled with sound, marks, direction, movement, shapes,
right.
color. And color, right? I think you're a damn good colorist, by the way. I've never told you that, but
Yeah.
the palettes that you use and how you move the viewer through, not just around, but into the work, and with color. But color's not the only thing, you know. The minimal work, like that last piece that you ended with, I think is pretty powerful conceptually. But then there's the materials. But then you're doing something that you've done consistently. You're putting one thing against the other that's contrasting. An image, a photograph, which is something you've done consistently. And it's right against this really dark and wonderful ground. And you said it's black glitter. If you can talk about those moments in your work where there's no sound, there's no music, it's only you thinking. You've edited out so much.
Right. Well, you know, part of that comes from I'm trying to reinvent myself every time with the subject matter, but I'm also trying to pare it down. But as I pare it down, I'm also trying to make it a little more complex in terms of thought. And I think sometimes there's that thought and there's that moment, there's that movement that's, you know, that's a part of it. There's that scale, and the scale is an important thing to me. So it's all about how high I can reach. It's about my own personal scale. It's really like me having a conversation with myself. sometimes it's like me playing chess with myself and putting myself in a very, like, you mentioned something about color. And I like to put colors that don't necessarily work good together and force them to have a conversation, force them to another set of colors that go over top of those colors. So it's that push and pull between the two, and that game of chess. And also reminding myself there's no such thing as a mistake. And there's not, even though I'm problem solving with the colors, I'm trying to learn to live with every mark and every mark I make. So it's like, if I'm working on something and the color doesn't work, I get excited about it because that's like a beautiful spot for me to make something happen. So it's a lot of that. I don't know if I'm answering that question, but
Not really, but we're going to circle back. We'll circle back on that.
I appreciate that.
Listen, the materials, I'm always fascinated by your use of materials, your selection process. We have a number of questions that people are asking about, how do you select materials? And can you talk about that process and more about ideas about sustainability, because you do use various types of materials.
Right. Well, I'll go back to the last piece. The last piece was done with black sand and black glitter. It was really about, when I thought about the black sands, I thought about the black sand beaches in Jamaica and referring to that, but then also like the glittery surfaces are used in some of my earlier work. I would use these kind of glittery surfaces. That was always a reference to like Haitian flags. And I was dealing with that because I was dealing with things that had shine and playing with the idea of glass used in different ways to repel. And then there's also the reflections of mirrors, and that's the same thing. So in terms of those materials, the way they last, they hold up pretty well. It's a tricky little balance between using materials that are not the typical materials that you put together. Like I used like Georgia clay. And
that was a question I had for you about the Georgia clay.
Yeah, the Georgia clay was, there's a lot based on the Georgia clay. It really came about when I remember building my house, the studio. I remember the trees being tore down, and I remember the trees falling down and knocking the trees down. But after that happens, there's a smell that comes from the earth, and then I'm also like thinking about that smell and thinking about, okay, there was Civil War back here, but there's also a reference to Native Americans. So it's a combination of all those different things. And then there's moments when I do small things I didn't really show them, but I work in Guam, but I collect water from different bodies of water that I would visit. Like I would go to Savannah, Georgia, and go to Tybee Island, I collect water. I collected water, so that's water from the Atlantic. So I would mix it into my work itself because it has another meaning when I do that. So the materials, I don't know, some of them are like tarps and they've been worn down and using the tarps because they were shipping. They have oil and all kinds of stuff in them. And I enjoy working with those kind of dirty materials. I enjoy going into an antique shop and smelling the past. Mm-hmm. I enjoy like the smell of the piano keys when they have that wood smell. And it's got the handling of a lot of people's DNA on top of those piano keys.
You are interested in the past.
You said what now?
You are really interested in the past.
Oh yeah. I'm interested in the present, and sometimes I start from the present and then realize that it comes from the past. So then I go back to the past and then I try to mix those together. And I take my own personal assumption. When I mix those together, I can create something that's kind of futuristic.
So, Rad, I think Professor Conrad does have a question.
Okay.
Where is she? Gillian?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much. And I really appreciate your talk and your work. And I'm particularly interested in what you just said about smelling the past, like especially from, you were talking about it in terms of objects. And I'm interested in the relationship of objects and I guess the physical nature, but also the historical nature and how you're relating them, or just how you're working with them um, in the crossover to painting. Like it feels like there's a kind of talismanic relationship to objects that you're either directly drawing from or you're trying to draw out from things we might not expect. And I wondered if you could say more about that. Like going
Okay,
back to the Inkisi or
right.
even to even to the way you're, I think, invoking like music when we can't hear it.
Okay. I'm gonna try my best to answer that question. Okay. So the fascination for me with African art was that, it was one of those things where I ran into a museum and I would see African art on the wall. I knew it was out of its original space. Um, I did not know a lot about a lot of objects. There are things there are things that have been written about the work itself and the particular groups of people who made work. A lot of times we go in and we see African art, we hear about the people who made it, but not the person. So that has a whole different thing. And when I look at these objects, I know that they were made specifically for a specific reason. And that
Mm,
reason is something that is, number one, it was meant to be very personal. It was to deal with something that was going on. It was also trying to, create what unseen. And so I am fascinated with traveling by way of responding to objects. I try to be very sensitive about it because sometimes, there are these images, things that don't come from, let's say, like, I can draw a lineage to it. I'm having kind of like the conversation between the Atlantic, that's the divide between the two, and trying to figure out ways to have those conversations. But I'm also like, you were talking about, I'm very interested in the self-taught artists, especially self-taught artists in the South. Those natural conversations that happen without even an object because they're making it and making it without even thinking about it. Like some of the ones that I know, I've seen, they're not making it because there's a gallery show. They're not making it because they can sell it. They were just making it just to make it, or they're making it in their yard, or they are, or there's another part of it where, somebody like Philip Simmons is making gates and doing metalwork in Charleston. And then, there's this fascination with tracing his tracing metal making and blacksmiths, west coast of Africa. And so, and then, you look at that and then you see like, there are people in Haiti making works, and then there are references, and then all of a sudden there's symbolism that pops up, and then there's snakes that are in it. And then there are like references to that and the Haitian deities. So, but but in terms of like materials, I feel like I have an antique shop. I collect things, and they sit pretty much like Michael was talking about, like the horns that sit on the wall. And eventually they find their way within my work. And I have a lot of stuff that doesn't find its way in my work. I don't know if I answered that question. Did I?
yeah, no, you did. I feel like I didn't really ask a question. I just sort of like gave you a bunch of different things to respond to, but I really appreciate that. I mean, I think I hear what you're talking about is the power, not just of materials, but of like specific objects, as you're saying, like made by specific people to communicate to us who are also specific people. And
Right.
yeah, I really appreciate your answer. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I can't hear you, Michael.
Oh,
Okay, I hear you now.
we have a question about the use of family photos from your own genealogy and ways that you navigate your personal history, or is it more like artifacts that inspire your work?
It's similar like the use of the fascination with African art. I'm responding to an object that was made at a certain time, and it was made to document. Let me see. For me, it was real personal because it was my grandmother giving me that photo album. And her giving me that photo album was really about like incorporating something that's very personal to me. And sometimes it's like working with things that are very personal to you. It's a sensitive space. It's kind of like sometimes I'm very insecure about presenting that personal information. And then there's that part of it that I just don't even talk about, because there may be a moment when I was making the work that I may have been dealing with something that was hard. You know, like I was recently dealing with the death of a friend, and there's a way in which that kind of manifests itself through my work, and it's moving at that moment, at that second. It's carrying the weight of like all the mess that's going on right now in the world. You carrying that and trying to figure out a way to operate with that, trying to figure out a way to do my own little magic with it and trying to correct, but then also trying to drag myself away from responding to it and allowing my creativity to shine in a different way.
You know, the history of portrait taking, the purpose for documenting a moment in one's life. I look at a number of images you have, images from old photographs of people you don't know. Obviously,
Right.
these photos are of people who've passed. How do you reconcile representing? Do you see them as symbolic of a lineage before and after? I mean, how do you reconcile dealing with that one person to be representational of a broader group when you're making your work? Because those photographs stand in for not only the people that are represented there or that particular time, but they seem to go back and potentially forward in terms of the range of representation. So
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, I also think about, those images would, if my grandmother never gave them to me, they'll end up becoming discarded. They'll end up becoming at some antique shop. You know, for me, it's like there's an image that I didn't show, which has a guy who has his leg crossed. He has a top hat, and he looks at you kind of in a very like mysterious way. And I use that image of him, which kind of like when I was talking about the guy with the image of the top hat and kind of like a self-portrait, he would pop up, his image I've used in several pieces, and I didn't show it in these slides, but those photographs became like deities for me. So I started using them in a different way. So they reoccur every once in a while. And it's me really searching for religion and spirituality. And it's like trying to find that connection.
There's a lot of respect I think you give to those photos. Proximity to the center of the picture plane, for example, the right. Radial balance, for example, formally, things relate to the central panel or image. So I see that as a way of and in most cases they anchor, in many cases I should say, they anchor the work. You know, everything relates to it. And I feel like that's, you're giving that representation some sort of respect. Rarely do I think I've seen images where you painted over them or you've taken moments from them.
Right.
But you do handle them with care, I think.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do. I think, you know, I feel like I'm still having that conversation with my grandma. I feel like I want to have that kind of conversation with her when I use the photographs. Other works, it's a different kind of experience. But with those photographs, yes, I'm very sensitive about those. Yeah.
I saw the work of Gordon Parks. I've never told you this before, but Gordon Parks was and remains a huge inspiration for me.
Right.
My first film was Three the Hard Way. And that line had a lasting effect upon me because as a child in Los Angeles, in Watts or Compton, wherever we were at the time, you know, things were getting bad with the gangs. And I didn't see what I saw on that screen, Jim Brown, Jim Kelly, and Fred Williamson, you know. I didn't see that in the communities that I was in. Did you freeze on me?
You froze, but I got you.
Yeah. I didn't see that in the communities that I lived in Los Angeles. But you know, Gordon Parks affected me in many ways. And again, in turn, as a young child, when I moved back to Louisiana, I was very introverted, and I had books with poems by oh wow, what's her name? Gwendolyn Brooks.
Right.
And in those books, there was images from Gordon Parks's poverty series. Now we know about Shaft, we know about exploitation films, his role there. You know, have you ever considered using any of those references, particularly images from his 50s series, his poverty series, his works in the 70s?
Right. The conversation came up recently with one of the directors of the Gordon Parks Foundation, and it was brought up. So there is a conversation about it. I'm probably more sensitive about it because I am married to his daughter. So I'm also like, yeah. And unfortunately, I never got a chance to meet him. But I was always a fan of his work, and he was definitely an influence, inspiration. And I remember even like when I was young in school and I was collaging and I was making images with my work, I actually used some of his work in my work, the actual use of a photograph. So, you know.
Yeah, I mean, there was, before I knew of Evandsy, it was Gordon Parks.
Right.
And I didn't even, I knew the name, I could apply the name years later, right? And I only opened this or move in this direction because, you know, you use images of the past. And let's face it, you are getting up there in age. So
I know you are.
You know, so there's an opportunity to move, you know, use other images. And I'm curious about, because of photography has changed because of technology. Do you ever think of ways in which technology can and perhaps is affecting your work today?
Yeah. There are some works. I mean, there are things that I've been working on in terms of printing and using imagery from, I don't know, different images that I've taken myself. But, you know, I print on sometimes aluminum and I print on steel. And so there are some photographic images that I do. And, you know, some of these photographs I'm fascinated with or making, I wouldn't say making an image. I wouldn't say making an image look older. I want to have a question mark about the image that I create. So I am working with some images that that I'm actually taking myself, and I've actually done images where I've taken images with I should show that image, but there were pieces where I took negatives of old photographs, and I took the negatives and printed them on top of mirrors, but I actually captured my backyard. And but those images I was doing, they were called Ghost. And so basically you would see those images, but you would also see yourself within it, but you would see something that was older, but then you would also see an image that I created from the present. So it's almost like this three-way photograph.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
I know it's a little early to ask a question like that. Where do you see yourself within the canon?
Right.
If I could walk through the lineage of Black art history. Let's just frame it that way, right?
Right.
I see hints and pieces of Romero Bearden,
Right.
Jake Lawrence there.
Right.
Help me out. Help me to move forward, because I think by the hints and pieces, that I could see, there are also the conceptual stuff that exists in a lot of other artists whose works you and I might know. It's not very,
Right.
many who may not be well known. Could you talk about that? And if you want to expand beyond that, please do. I just tried to frame it in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I make work that it deals with those connections between those early artists that I've been influenced by, who I've met as a child, to ones that I heard about. I was connected to my college professor, was a student of a guy named Harper T. Phillips. Harper T. Phillips was taught by Hale Woodruff. And so there's a connection between that. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I say, wow. Hale Woodruff.
Yeah. Yeah. And so there are some connections to that. And there's a mix. There are things that are being made today. Sure, I'm influenced by a lot of things. I'm influenced by, when I think about it, I don't know at all. Architecture is something that really is today. That's something that's really influenced me. I'm working on projects where I'm creating an amphitheater. I'm kind of making like these structures where I'm dealing with sidewalks, and I'm working with these different materials and thinking about it, because I think that one of my first, I don't know, I was interested in going to school and studying architecture, but I never did follow through. I took a route where I didn't really push myself, but later.
Hold up, man! You just can't disrespect the visual artists like that.
No.
You took a route that you just didn't work hard. I mean, so you became a.
No. That's not that. The route was, it was easier for me to go to art school and apply myself towards art school. No.
You did it again.
No, I want to do a lot of things, man. I want to play baseball. Did you want to play basketball?
Yeah, we never talked about that, because you did have some really amazing works about baseball that you produced over the years. Of course, they weren't shown in the slides.
Right. Yeah, but I mean, I think that I found the perfect medium for me, and I'm able to, because of what we're able to deal on the different forms, and which I think is beautiful, because we can go into that space and we can make those references. So yeah, and I'm influenced by so much. I just try not to limit myself.
So I have a question. Can you, in reference to your work, do you feel that perhaps performance art would be a next step since you paint and do sculpture and use audio, sound as well as installation in terms
Yeah.
of repertoire?
Is that a next step? That's a step. I mean, you know, I think I also think about the dance and the work in the studio as a performance. But there's a way that I could show it, and I've tried at many moments to do it, but it was in different forms. I remember working on pieces like when I was doing earlier stuff, dealing with the subject of baseball and building like these sculptures that were wooden bats that were 11 feet tall. I also had an element where I had a friend playing the umpire in the show, but calling out numbers from the slave trade. And, you know, there are parts of that in my work as well. There are some parts where I've actually used like my cousin's 1951 Cadillac, and he painted it black. And I remember using the video screens, and there was somewhat of a performance of the way in which we entered the gallery, but it's a different way. I am thinking about it a lot in different ways, and some of it is coming from the influence of the movie studios that are here in Atlanta, and I'm still trying to work it out. Yeah, I'm getting to a space.
So Radcliffe, why aren't there any white people in your work?
Why aren't there any white people? Why aren't there any white people in my work?
I'm not sure if I meant that as a joke to you or not. It's my way of leading into concepts about Blackness in your work. The historical perspective, through the photographs, through the reference to the Underground Railroad, for example, or even your dad's work on the railroad, the prominence of the railroad system in early 20th century America as it pertains to Black men, really, porters, for example. So can you talk about, there is an element about making work that relates to the evolution of Blackness within American culture in your work? Talk about that.
I think so. I hope so. You know, I don't think about it a lot. I think it's there. You know, I'm in the way I work, and I may not answer it the way you asked the question, but the way I work is, you know, I may have said this before, but I don't live in an art hub or a place where many galleries, many museums. I'm a little bit more like, when it comes to art, I'm really having a conversation with myself with art. So I don't really have a lot of conversations about the work I do in the studio. You know, living in Atlanta, you know, African-American community, a lot of African-American mayors. I've been here, it's always been African-American mayors, understanding Black businesses. You know, Hank is around the corner. You know, I have like Andy Young. We have a lot of people. Reverend Lowry. So in terms of that, I think that's always been like a big influence in that environment. And it always really trying to preserve those histories, because I feel like at some moment those histories, I wouldn't say they disappear, but they're not. I don't know. I don't know if I'm even answering your question.
I think you are. And the preservation of those histories or creating those connections to the past, I think, is relevant in the context of this particular medium, because a lot of these histories are lost. Obviously, you name some names that are folks that are still around and your community and contribute a lot to that community. But they too, their time shall pass like ours, you know?
Right.
The record of this might be useful in some way, but you're doing it in the space of fine arts, and you're doing it on a grand level, you know? So, you know, it's not so much of a political thing. I know, I feel like when looking at it, it's a genuine response to waking up and what interests you in your work, you know?
You're right. Right. Yeah.
I don't want to
Yeah.
ask a question for you, but you know.
Right. Right. Yeah. 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 Thank you.
Hey, listen, we have another question here. Would you be able to talk about your use of painting, of the painting space as a kind of a shelf to arrange objects? This is sometimes a literal placement of the shelf, of a shelf, where a flat plane references a backdrop to present a specific object. I wonder about how you see the relationship between the flat plane and the objects and forms that sit in front of it. That's an interesting question.
Right.
Yeah.
What are my thoughts? Um, I don't. A lot of it's just like, yeah, it's exactly just it's moving around. It's working in space. I think part of being like when I was in school and I was making sculpture, uh, I was making. I started out making forms, but I started out making pieces for sculpture to connect to, making things that hung on a wall in that kind of space, that kind of like, I'm like curating, often I'm curating objects. You know, I have a piece that's in the background, um, and there's a shelf behind it, but that's like a little concrete block I made with oyster shells and dealing with the subject of tabby. And so for me, it's really about creating that kind of space, that certain height, that eye level, that, you know, I don't know. I don't know. I just kind of, it just happens for me. I don't know. Um,
I didn't think about that shelf aspect. There's a number of shelves.
yeah. I mean, you know, and it's the cabinets, and the cabinets are shelves themselves too. They're boxes, you know.
There's
I feel like, you say what now?
a lot of doorways, doors, windows.
Doorways, windows. I was always influenced by like stage sets and making these kind of spaces that were, you know, I wasn't thinking about the installation. I was thinking as freestanding objects. I began to make stuff. I was interested in the artist and more so, and I remember seeing, you know, these different placements, these blocks, and these kind of. I like to, which is, I was in school. I would work with big, and I would bolt them together, and it was creating these kind of things that were not just a straightforward forms, but they were really meant to hold. And so, yeah, the cabinet work of it is a whole different thing too.
Well, let me see if we have one more.
Okay. I hope I'm answering the questions right.
Yeah, I think you're doing a great job. That was our last question. Are there any other things that you'd like to raise your hands, man? Wasn't that bad? Any other things you'd like to share with us? Practice? Any upcoming exhibitions?
Upcoming exhibitions. I have two public commissions that are going up. One I'm kind of building kind of like an amphitheater, and another one I'm working in Greensboro, North Carolina, dealing with a public sculpture, but I'm really creating a park. And it's, I would say, kind of in response to sit-ins, but it's, yeah, I'm doing it. I think it's an interesting moment for all of us to work in the studio with all this madness going on. I think it's a good time to focus and try to tune the news out.
Good luck with that.
I know.
It's fascinating. Your work is bridging out into space and architectural space. So here you revisit the place where you once was in terms of your thoughts.
Yeah.
It's never gone. It's just taking a different route.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Radcliffe Bailey, I thank you for the work that you've done thus far, and the work that you've yet to complete. And I thank you for spending time with us here today at and coming to our community and to share your ideas and your work with us. So
thank you.
I appreciate your work. I still want my painting.
Still waiting for mine.
Take it easy, and thank you again, brother. Appreciate it.
Thank you.